The C8 ZR1 is fast, but just going off of its 1,000+ horsepower, this is something we already knew. But how quick it would get around a racetrack was kind of an open question until now. Because during testing, a group of GM engineers have been taking the ZR1 to a bunch of different racetracks and setting the production car lap record at every single one. And it's funny because it wasn't that long ago that the Corvette kind of had this reputation of being a midlife crisis car. The shift to a mid-engine layout has helped to shake that reputation and turn the Corvette into a legitimate supercar. So today we are going to talk about how the C8 is such a radical departure from all the cars that came before it, how that has helped change the perception around the Corvette, and discuss if the ZR1 is really the fastest production car ever. So the Corvette is one of the longest running continually produced sports cars, and for the majority of its lifespan, it has followed the same basic layout. It featured a Pushrod V8 engine that was mounted in the front of the car. It was rear-wheel drive and predominantly sold with a manual transmission. And while during the 1950s, when the first Corvette models started to hit the road, that was a completely normal and acceptable layout, things would pretty quickly escalate. During the 1960s and the 1970s, the upper echelon of sports cars would all start to transition to a mid-engine layout, primarily for better weight distribution, which helps traction. And even back then, there were plenty of people at GM that were trying to steer the Corvette in that direction, namely Zachary Arkus-Duntov, also known as Zora. GM would go on to even show off a few concept versions of the Corvette that featured this type of layout, but ultimately they would decide to stay the course with the front-engine Corvette. So besides just the engine layout, another area where the Corvette would kind of have a divergence from the rest of the high-performance car market was with its transmission. In the 1990s, we would start to see the introduction of the automated manual transmission. Basically just a manual that has a computer that operates the clutch and the gear shifter for you. Where things would really change was in the late 2000s with the introduction of the dual clutch. The dual clutch offers lightning fast gear changes while still giving the driver complete control over gear selection. All the while, up until the C8, GM did not dabble with either the automated manual or the dual clutch. The last place where the Corvette had kind of diverged from the rest of the supercar market was with its powertrain. Now, GM is famous for their Pushrod V8 engines. They came up with the very basic design like 70 years ago and have used all of that time to just refine this engine and make it more efficient. Along the way, they've put it in everything from pickup trucks to family sedans to their sports cars. The modern iteration of these engines are either referred to as the LS or select versions of the LT series. And largely, I am a very big fan of these engines. They are compact, they are super durable, they're efficient, they're relatively cost effective, and they have a massive amount of aftermarket support. But the one thing that it is not is exotic. And when I say exotic, when a lot of people picture the engine in a supercar, they picture something with a super high red line that revs really fast, that has a shrieking, high-pitched exhaust note. And while these engines do offer some legitimate advantages over a Pushrod V8, I would say to the average buyer of one of these cars, the most important factor is just that it feels more exotic. And guys, just quick interruption, if you are enjoying this video, please consider tossing it a like, sharing it with one of your friends, or subscribing to the channel. I would super appreciate it as I try to get this thing off the ground. So to take all of these different things back to the Corvette, while it may have never kind of conformed to the high performance or supercar market more broadly, that doesn't mean that it wasn't effective. The C7 iteration of the Corvette was still a very impressive car. The ZR1 in particular was making over 700 horsepower and was one of the fastest production cars at every racetrack it visited. Now, despite the very high level of performance the Corvette was capable of, I still kind of think it was thought of as a second-rate car compared to some of those offerings coming out of Europe. And still, it kind of had this nagging reputation for being an old man car. But with the C8 now having been on sale for 5 years, I think it has completely changed how everyone perceives the Corvette. And I think the reasons for that, first and foremost, is they finally transitioned the Corvette to a mid-engine layout, fulfilling the dreams of Zora. And with this transition comes all of the benefits that we've known about since the 1960s: better weight distribution, better traction, better handling, better acceleration. But this new engine layout would not be the only change. The transmission would also be transitioned to a dual clutch as the only option. And while I personally am kind of sad to see the manual go, for what GM was trying to accomplish with this car, it likely was the best option. One piece of the C8 that didn't change was the engine. The base model Stingray Corvette still uses the latest iteration of that Pushrod V8. But I actually think this is kind of a good thing. Up into this point, I've kind of been comparing the Corvette against some very high-end car companies, the likes of Ferrari, Lamborghini, and McLaren. But the one thing that makes the Corvette super special compared to all of those different car companies is its price. Comparing to the lowest priced vehicle from any of those brands, the Corvette is still going to come in at about half or a third of the base price. And that is due, at least in part, to GM continuing to just stick with the same engine design and refine it over time. Now, of course, there is more than just the base model Corvette. There are several high-performance trims that are intended to directly compete against some of those supercars. The first one that we will briefly touch on is the E-Ray. To build the E-Ray, they basically take the Stingray's powertrain, put it into a wide body, add an electric motor up front, making it the first all-wheel drive and the first hybrid Corvette. The intent here being to try and compete against some of the hybrid supercars that are coming out of Japan and Europe. But for me, where things really start to get interesting is with the Z06. And what makes the Z06 so special is that it features a completely brand new powertrain. As I've mentioned several times now, what GM is famous for is that old Pushrod V8 design, but that is not what's in the Z06. It features a 5.5 liter naturally aspirated dual overhead cam flat plane crank V8. This ends up being good for 670 horsepower and an 8,500 RPM redline. That type of engine is far more similar to what you would find in a Ferrari than your typical Corvette. And of course, the Z06 gets all of the accompanying support to handle that extra power. So it in itself has a wider body than the standard Corvette, better brakes, better suspension, and a whole lot of focus on its aerodynamics. But the Z06 is not the king of the hill Corvette. That title, at least for now, belongs to the ZR1. Basically, you take the Z06 and throw a couple of turbos onto its V8 and then upgrade every other part of the car to handle that additional power. So even better brakes, even better suspension, even more crazy aerodynamics. What this all ends up resulting in is a car that makes 1,064 horsepower and I think comes in at a comparably reasonable base price of $175,000. And while this car is not officially on sale quite yet, a group of GM engineers have had the opportunity to take it around a bunch of different racetracks, and it is very fast. At Road America, it set a time of 2 minutes 8.6 seconds, which beats the prior production car lap record set by the GT3 RS by over 5 seconds. Admittedly, Road America is a power track, so let's take a look at a few other examples. At Road Atlanta, it set a time of 1 minute 22.8 seconds, beating the GT2 RS by 2 seconds. At the VIR Grand Course, it set a time of 2 minutes 32.3 seconds, which beats out the McLaren Senna by, again, 2 seconds. The final two racetracks that they tested the car at, I had a little bit of a hard time finding what the prior record holder was, but all of the outlets are reporting this as a new lap record. So we have a 147 around the VIR full course, and a 150 2.7 at Watkins Glen. So that kind of begs the question, is the new ZR1 the fastest production car ever made? And I think the answer is possibly. Let's kind of put this in context. One thing that is working in the ZR1's favor are the drivers. The people conducting these tests were largely GM engineers and management. And it is clear they are all very skilled drivers, but I think in the hands of a professional race car driver, we could be talking about full seconds that get shaved off of these times. One thing working against the ZR1 is that a lot of the cars it is beating are from the last generation of supercars. Like the McLaren Senna, it is still a very fast and impressive car, but it's not like the hot new thing anymore. The new GT3 RS is a new supercar, but I think it's really intended to compete more so with the Z06, and it's really the new GT2, whenever that does come out, that will be a direct competitor for the ZR1. And a lot of the time when this new generation of supercars does come out and destroys all of the prior lap times, a lot of what ends up driving that is advancements in tire technology and more aggressive aerodynamics. So whenever this new generation of supercars does end up coming out, like a new GT2 RS, the newest iteration of the Senna, and they have this advantage with tire technology and aero, it will be interesting to see if the delta between the ZR1 is still quite as big. The other kind of issue here in declaring the ZR1 the fastest production car is that a lot of these supercar companies are now kind of building these crazy one-off models. Like the McLaren Speedtail, the Ferrari Daytona SP3, or the Mercedes AMG 1. These cars are so incredibly rare and so incredibly valuable that getting them tested all at the same racetrack is going to be a pretty big challenge. And let alone having them tested on the same day with the same driver under the same conditions, which is really what would provide us the most empirical answer. And that points to another thing in that maybe we can consider the ZR1 to be the quickest production car ever, because it is an actual production car. With a lot of the models that I just mentioned, they cost millions of dollars, and maybe the automakers make a few hundred, maybe 200, maybe 300. The Corvette, while expensive, will come in around $200,000, and GM will likely sell a few thousand of these cars. The ultimate proving ground continues to be the Nürburgring, and if the ZR1 goes to the ring and it beats everything south of $1.5 million and isn't production limited, then I am counting that as a win. Overall, the C8 has proven that the Corvette is most certainly now a supercar, and maybe with the ZR1 you could debate hypercar, and I eagerly await whatever other high performance trims may be coming with the Zora and whatever else GM might have up their sleeve.